Hello, I'm going to talk a little bit about review bombing. Recently, the subject of review bombing has come back up into relevance after the game Firewatch received review bombs from users who are very upset with how the Campo Santo developer spoke to PewDiePie and offered the DMCA against his live streams and Firewatch-related content. Basically, the Firewatch dev didn't like PewDiePie's face. So they said, alright, that means that you can't use any of our stuff anymore. We're revoking your ability to use live streams in fair use. Is this legal? Is it not legal? Well, the answer is sort of a little bit of both. There's no clear precedent about this. And ultimately, that's why this was such a huge deal. Like I said in the last video that I did, the biggest takeaway from the whole PewDiePie live streaming controversy that came out was this section. Is it okay for a developer to tell a YouTuber, to tell a live streamer that they're not allowed to use their games or to stream their games because they said something they didn't like or because the devs just didn't like that live streamer in particular? This had the ability to change the landscape of streaming. It gave developers potentially the ability to just slay YouTube channels. If their DMCA against PewDiePie had gone forward, that could have set a really bad precedent. And it's for that I really don't like these devs now. They were willing, in order to virtue signal, they were willing to put this law that's kind of in limbo right now, these rules which are kind of hovering around the area of is it allowed, is it not allowed, they're willing to put that into jeopardy so that they could show the world just what good quality people they are. As a result, Firewatch was hit with tons and tons of bad reviews. Firewatch, which was sitting at 83% positive feedback, has slipped in the last 30 days to 47% positive. So now, that's under the 50% mark. Less than half the people who play the game give it a positive review, and that reflects very poorly on the game. And that kind of thing hurts sales. Maybe another of the most notable examples of this is Fallout 4. Bethesda's behavior in terms of Fallout 4 has been less than stellar. And it's not just because the game itself, when it came out, was disappointing. It's the way that they've treated mods and the way that they've done other things. Most namely, in recent memory, their focus and push for this creation club, aka paid mods. On Steam, Fallout 4 has a total review score of 69% positive. But shockingly, the recent reviews done in the last 30 days are only 12% positive, setting them to overwhelmingly negative. And that shit looks bad. You know, it kind of slipped under the radar for a lot of people, but Nier Automata, Nier is a game that got review bombed recently as well by the Chinese because they released the game in China without Chinese language support and they doubled the price for it, so they got hit with a huge flood of review bombs from Chinese players. And China is the number 3 country in terms of population for Steam, the number 2 in terms of bandwidth. Other examples include Grand Theft Auto 5. That was in the news. That was a big thing because the publisher for Grand Theft Auto, Take-Two, they decided to kill the popular modding tool Open4, or OpenIV for the medically inclined. That got them 35,000 negative reviews in just a few days, and it serves them right, I say. Crusader Kings 2. That got a few hundred negative reviews really quickly because Paradox decided to raise the price of its game in some reasons. What's interesting, though, is that in both of those two cases, because of this overwhelmingly negative, sudden response... Apparently I'm getting a call. Well, that was steamy. Like I was saying, in response to these review bombs, the companies eventually pulled back from their decisions because gamers had made it clear through review bombing that this was not something that they found okay. Remember when Bethesda tried to do the paid mods fiasco with Skyrim? And of course, they've just rehashed and revitalized paid mods through the Creation Club, and, well, we could see the reviews of Fallout 4 suffering right now. It's at 14% positive, I'll remind you. There are other examples as well, but I think you get the picture. But is it an ethical business practice? Is it ethical for consumers to do this? That's a discussion that I think we need to actually have and at least think about. Personally, I'm in the position that review bombing is an acceptable practice for consumers to do, because first off, I'm a consumer-first YouTuber, gamer. I'm pro-consumer before I am pro-platform, before I'm pro-game, before I'm pro-developer. That's not to say that I don't think that publisher, developer, consumer, all these things can work well and in tandem with one another. And that's certainly not to say that just because a consumer does it means it's okay. But let's look at why people take part in these review bombs. Why do they do it? Well, don't they have any other sort of course of action that they can take? Can't a consumer, can't a gamer who has a problem with the game, can't they do anything else? Well, unfortunately, the answer for a lot of people is no. And there's a lot to be said about the argument that bombing reviews with negative opinions, that's the only way to get people's attention when it's done en masse. Sure, when gamers get angry, and there are many legitimate reasons why they might get angry over video games, they can go to forums or threads on NeoGAF or this or that, all sorts of other gaming websites, but those are external from the places that people actually buy the video games, especially if you're on PC. Let's say you go to Steam. It's very obvious what the rating and the score is for those games once they're there on the store page. It's right there in the basic information, right underneath the name and the description. It's got the total reviews, and it's got the recent reviews. Impossible to miss. And gamers know that if you go to Steam, if you go to Metacritic, and if you go and put these negative reviews in masse, this looks really bad to people who are looking at that game. And it sends a clear signal to developers that they are not happy. Does this affect sales? It's not certain, but I imagine that it would, to some degree. I know that if I am looking for a game to play, and I go to that game, and that game has really negative, bad reviews attached to it, a lot of the times I'll pass over it without a second thought. When I look at a game and I see overwhelmingly negative reviews, I know either the game is shit, or the developers or publishers did something super shady and I don't want to be a part of it. I'm a discerning consumer doggo, and I know when things aren't right. I can sniff out trouble. I'd say it's very likely that even though we aren't certain that it hurts immediate or short-term sales of a video game, I would wager it does have an impact on future sales from the developer, future sales of maybe later installments of a series. Do you think that Fallout 5 or the next Elder Scrolls game is going to be bought in the same droves as games before it were? I don't know, it's possible that it will be, but at least from my personal perspective, I'm very wary of any Bethesda title that releases from this point out. Bethesda's kind of being really douchey lately. In fact, so is Nintendo. In fact, those people on the YouTube Nintendo Creators Program, they just got told that they're not allowed to do live streaming anymore. My opinion of Nintendo right now is pretty awful. And I wouldn't be surprised if this had some pretty serious backlash in terms of how creators respond to it, and if review bombing was a thing on Nintendo platforms, I wouldn't be surprised if it happened at all. All companies have the potential to do really shady stuff, really anti-consumer stuff. Companies can be dicks. Companies can be excessively greedy. There are times when companies are well within their rights to do something or make consumers pay for something. Yeah, that is absolutely a concern that is justified. Just because a consumer does something that seems really off the mark doesn't mean that they're not justified in doing so. But a lot of the times, that's not the case, as we all know. But how do consumers make that known? How is a consumer going to tell a company in the most obvious way that they do not approve? It's not just sentiment on this place or that place, on this forum online, that forum online. It's to go to places like Steam, directly to places like Steam, and make it obvious that something is amiss with consumers. Now, what you are review bombing, that plays a big part, though, in whether or not I think it's acceptable to do. Sometimes people get upset and angry, many times unjustifiably so. It's the internet. There's always been a mob mentality that can persist. And sometimes when people get upset and angry because something's been added or taken away, their anger isn't necessarily justified. At least review bombing isn't necessarily justified. But I think that even that said, the good things that review bombing does far outweighs the bad. There are some out there who think that review bombing is bad to do, and I understand some of their concerns, though I don't share their ultimate opinion. One of the issues that they take with review bombing is that oftentimes the reason for a review bomb doesn't actually have anything to do with the game's quality itself. There have been times when the behavior of a developer has led to review bombs of that developer's game. Nothing in the game actually got changed. Nothing was added or taken away, and nothing anti-consumer was done, at least inside the framework of the game. Action was taken somewhere else. And as a result, this was people's, or at least they felt this was their best way to voice their displeasure towards the developers, by going after the reviews of the game. In that regard, I feel like these should be taken on an individual basis. Sometimes things can be done outside of a game that can, players might say, impact the game later, makes them worry about the quality of future titles. Or perhaps it's something that was directly insulting. Or when they get political. 2064 ROM developers Midboss, they found this out themselves when they said back in early 2017, if you voted for Trump or support his fascist regime, please don't play our game. Just go fuck off. Well, it turns out that when you insult people and tell them to fuck off because you think that Trump's a fascist, it's fucking retarded, people are going to get upset at that. And people are going to fire back the way that they know how. They're going to review bomb your game because, well, if you tell people to fuck off based on who they support politically and to not play your game, what message does that send to the people who bought your game? If I had bought this game and I read this tweet, especially as someone who voted for Trump, I'd be like, okay, to hell with these guys. I mean, if they're going to try to get political here, I'm not going to support them. And it's not the fact that you get political. It's the fact that you get political in such a demeaning and insulting manner. I mean, look, there are tons of devs whose games I play, and I'm sure that I disagree with many of them. There's a lot of people I play with that I disagree with. There's a lot of people that I have played with that I disagree with, I'm sure, and it doesn't bother me. But when you attack your consumer base and when you insult them, what do you think they're going to do? That's why later they had to say, hey, if you enjoy 2064 ROM, please consider leaving us a review. We got brigaded by alt-right folks. And so they just double down. If you fucking like Trump, you're alt-right. What if a game came out that I played, and even if it was a good game, the developers openly on Twitter started saying racist stuff? White people suck, or gay people are terrible, it's immoral, you'll burn in hell, white people are all racist and criminal, and they're blah blah blah, fill in the blank, whatever you want to say. How do you think that people would react to that? Now, is it the right thing to do? Is it ethical for the consumer to do that to a game because the developer said something that was admittedly awful or ridiculous or insulting? Well, I suppose that's part of the conversation. And that's probably a question you're going to have to ask yourself and think about. I'm going to take every single instance of this happening as an individual. There's no real blanket answer, I don't feel. In situations like these, I feel like it's much more justifiable to hold the position that review bombs aren't, well, justified, because it doesn't have anything to do with the games themselves. It has to do just with statements that the developers have made. It's a matter of, they hit me, how do I hit them back? They made a statement and it's really bad PR, so what am I going to do to voice my displeasure at it? That's obviously the much more debatable side. However, I think it's hard to argue against the idea that it's not justifiable to review bomb a game if that game actually degraded in quality, or if features were stripped or taken away, or if they added something that's horrible. That's why Fallout 4 is sitting at a recent review score of 14% positive. Because of the Creation Club. Because of paid mods Mark II. Something that was overwhelmingly hated by gamers practically universally. just came back under a different name, in a different skin. When Grand Theft Auto 5 and Take-Two, when they tried to kill the modding tools, gamers reacted in a very appropriate way. They were being stripped of a feature that was considered a mainstay of the series, something that was integral to PC gaming itself, something that was so much a part of the experience people couldn't dream of a Grand Theft Auto without it. A blatantly anti-consumer move Take-Two made, and they suffered the consequences with the review bomb, and they eventually decided to go back and they changed their mind. What's interesting, though, is that when I was looking up information on review bombs and getting some opinions on both sides about whether or not it was ethical or justifiable, I came across an article on Kotaku. Steam review bombing is a problem by none other than Nathan Grayson. Review bombs, however, often detonate because someone started snapping at the wrong wire or struck a nerve by adding an unwanted feature or saying or doing something certain people disliked. I don't like, though, how he frames this. He frames it like review bombs are done for petty reasons, especially when he says, struck a nerve by adding an unwanted feature. The Creation Club was more than just striking a nerve by adding an unwanted feature. It was adding paid mods to a game. When Take-Two went after Open 4, they weren't just striking a nerve with people. Calling these things as just striking a nerve, that's ridiculous, quite frankly, Nathan. It's a slap in the face to the concept of consumer rights. It's not about whether or not consumers are entitled to certain things. It's about buying a product and having reasonable expectations for that product and having those things be taken away. There are many legitimate reasons for a game to have a huge flood of negative reviews associated with it. And I know you might not like that idea. Just like the Dean Takahashi Cuphead controversy that happened not too long ago, this seems like yet another opportunity that a video game journalist, especially one with, well, the infamy that you have, this was an opportunity for a video game journalist to actually side with the gamers for once. And, it wasn't done. Nathan, the article that you wrote on this subject, you paint gamers as whiny, spoiled, entitled. You don't see the legitimacy in a lot of the things that they do. Gamers, in a lot of ways, they're desperate. Gamers don't have much recourse. The industry is consistently and constantly doing things that are shady and shaky, that are anti-consumer, that rub people the wrong way and for obvious reasons. And a lot of the times, the way that you can combat this behavior, it's not obvious. And a lot of the times, developers and publishers will ignore it. They would much rather try to make their buck. People have watched names and companies and franchises that they've loved go to the wayside in terms of quality. And it's hard to organize mass protests in terms of not buying games. It's a lot easier for gamers to come together and say, hey, we need to review this game negatively because the devs are fucking us over. Because they did something that's really anti-consumer, because they took away a feature that was in the game or something that was expected based on its predecessors, or they added something to the game that in some way diminished its replayability or the player's ability to enjoy it at all. Other changes to Steam, like the refund system that was, well, quite frankly, way overdue, that was added, helps to some degree. A lot of the times players will refund a game if they don't like it instead of taking to the reviews and leaving something negative. This is what Lars Dukat said, and I apologize if I'm butchering your name. He's the developer of Defender's Quest. And in regards to being review bombed, he did say that in an interview with PC Gamer, and I'll link the article below, that it's hard for him to feel sorry for big AAA companies that do things that are obviously tone deaf and anti-consumer, and you pay a public price for it. One of those high-profile examples was Grand Theft Auto 5, and you could see in this graph from the PC Gamer article just how staggering a sudden deluge of negative reviews looks on the graph. The article also goes into the player base in China. China has a lot of people in it, especially when it comes to PC gamers. They're a market that is, now more so than ever, simply impossible to ignore. There's too many people and there's too many voices. And for those of us who are watching this video who are mostly console players, it's important to remind you that PC gaming is much more worldwide and connected in that regard. The United States isn't the only country that exists. But we are the best. In order to protest the lack of a Chinese localization in Football Manager 2017, in October of 2016, Chinese players gave the game hundreds of negative reviews. You see, the studio's director, years before, had said that, well, if we sell more in China, then we'll localize better to China. But apparently that never happened, and people were obviously upset. Later in April, Sega decided that they would indeed announce a Chinese localized version. And so many positive reviews sprung up, and many people went back to get rid of their old negative reviews. But Football Manager 2017 wasn't the only game who saw these negative review bombs. Football Manager 2016, its predecessor, also received them. There are other examples of people review bombing and having that spill over to other games, even if those games have nothing to do with the other game, if they're just developed by the same person or published by the same person, well, corporate entity. For instance, The Rise of the Tomb Raider in late April got a Chinese review bomb as well, because Square Enix decided that Nier Automata's price changed in Chinese currency, which they saw as unfair. Darkest Dungeon got a review bomb from the Chinese because of lack of localization when it was promised, and just wasn't being delivered fast enough. When it comes to review bombing, again, the Chinese market is it's not going to be viable to ignore for much longer. Lars Dukat, the guy I talked about earlier, the developer of Defender's Quest, he said that, I have never had a localization pay for itself this quickly, not to mention this unambiguously. Of all the revenue Defender's Quest has earned from China on Steam in its entire lifetime, 45% of it was earned last week, once he released the game in China. He said it basically doubled the entire lifetime sale of the game from China almost immediately after localizing it for the country. Which gives me a whole lot of hope in terms of indie developers, because if anything that Dukat said is something to go by, and it probably is, we can see developers, especially of smaller games and indie games, localizing their games for the Chinese market and then being much more successful because of it. But let's look at it from an English-speaking perspective. In terms of the game itself and how it plays and its features, it doesn't matter to me whether or not the game is localized for Mandarin. Or bananas or whatever, I don't know, whatever they speak in China. I'm gonna go out on a limb and say it's Chinese. As an English-speaking consumer of this game, do I want to go onto Steam or any other platform and see the effects of Chinese speakers who didn't get the game in their language or properly localized for them? Does that help me? Does it help me to make a more informed buying decision? What if 90% of English speakers liked a game, but there was a big review bomb from Chinese players who didn't get the localization they maybe were promised? What if that brought down the overall score to a 40 or a 50 or a 60 or even lower? Should reviews themselves be localized? Should it be a toggleable option? Toggleable is a strange word. Toggleable. Should reviews be toggleable? Now I'm laughing at it. Should reviews be able to be toggled based on your region? See the total score from players around the world and then have the option to check out the score of players who are in your area? I understand localization itself isn't cheap, but it's not exactly a profitless endeavor either. Though I suppose that's up to the developers to decide, not me. But ultimately, this entire conversation goes back to the idea that should games suffer in their review scores for things that are not necessarily related to the gameplay of the game itself? That's kind of the penultimate question here. Should a game be scored lower because Chinese players didn't get their localization? Deserve it or not? Should a game be downvoted because the developer said something, I don't know, racist, sexist, bigoted, hateful, or just mean-spirited online? If the developer comes out as a douchey, whiny asshole who insults his consumers? I mean, it's an interesting question that we need to ask ourselves going forward. Because eventually there might come a time where someone wants to really make some important decisions based around this idea. Maybe there would be policy changes, who knows? But should you review a game negatively because it's not in your language? That's an interesting thought to ponder. It's easy for us to maybe make a judgment when we in the English-speaking world are catered to by a huge amount of developers. And it's not bad that we are. I mean, we're the biggest part of the market. We have a vested interest in being catered to in that way. That's just business. And that's not to say that a huge section of the world also doesn't speak English as well. But would that mean that we're justified in giving a game that's clearly made in Japan, for instance, and is released on Steam without an English version, does that mean that we should give it negative reviews? Some might say no, some might say yes if we were promised such a thing and they didn't deliver or change their minds. But this is the kind of question that you can ask 100 people and get 100 different answers from. I've been scouring comment sections like I often do to get opposing perspectives and to see people debate back and forth on reasons why they should or shouldn't do something or whether or not something is good or bad. And this is an interesting discussion, I think, that needs to be had again. Overall, my personal take on the matter is that review bombing is a double-edged sword. And in this kind of industry, one that wasn't made this way by necessarily consumers themselves, I see it as doing too much good to get rid of as a tactic. When you take companies like Rockstar, Take-Two, Paradox, all them, and you can get them to make visible actual changes to their game and backpedal on anti-consumer mechanics or changes that they featured in their games because of review bombing, it's hard to look at these massive victories and then at the same time say, we shouldn't allow it because there's a potential for some games and some developers to get the shit end of the stick from it when they don't necessarily deserve it. Ultimately, that's a question that each individual consumer has to decide for themselves. And unfortunately, it will be abused sometimes. Like pretty much everything is. That's just the nature of the beast. The best solution would be to use review bombing as a tool in order to fight against anti-consumer practices that, especially a lot of large corporations and companies do, and oftentimes to beloved titles or series that have reputations and expectations to meet. Getting rid of modding and shutting down the open-for modding tool that Take-Two did, that's a blatant anti-consumer move that lowers the quality of the game and lessens the experience of the people who play it. It's something that could have been completely avoided. It was a dick move by Take-Two to do, and I fully support review bombing in cases like those. I think they're unambiguously justified. But maybe a game has a certain political message that you don't like, or maybe the dev insults someone, like even yourself, on Twitter, or if they make a political statement that you find is charged and divisive. These are those gray areas and places where perhaps review bombing isn't so cut and dry. I think the reason that so many players turn to review bombing as a tool to express their dissatisfaction with a game is because they feel like there's so few tools at all for them to use. The consumer's arsenal is very limited. They can not buy the game, they could get a refund, they could review bomb, spread through word of mouth their dissatisfaction. Not everybody has a big YouTube channel where they can take their opinions, put them out there, and get tens of thousands of views and responses. But a player knows that it's a very arbitrary thing, a negative to a positive review. They know that they could go to the review section of a game, they could go to Metacritic, they can go to Steam, and they can leave a review, and that review counts for something. It's an actual number, a quantifiable example of their dissatisfaction that they could go and they could look at and they know other people will see. Perhaps one of the best things that consumers like you and I can do is to change the way that we look at reviews and change the way that reviews affect our buying decisions. I've never ever been a fan of the numerical system of reviews, 1 out of 10 being horrible, 9 out of 10 being amazing. Because there are tons of 9 out of 10 games out there that are amazing and stellar and have all these things going for them that a lot of people just will have no interest in because it's not their kind of game, or they don't particularly like one mechanic enough to have it resonate poorly with the rest. Obviously, in a perfect world, review bombing is the right thing to do. That's what reviews are for. If a lot of people hit your game with a large amount of negative reviews, that means you've done something. Even for questionably unjustifiable reasons for review bombs, something was done. They don't happen for no reason. There's always an action that's taken by a developer, by a publisher. It could be a localization issue. It could be the removal of mods, inflation of prices. People don't just randomly decide to hit some game with negative reviews for no reason. Gamers didn't just wake up one day as a collective and decide that gamers were dead, or that there should be negative reviews for Fallout 4. If I had to rate it, well, I wouldn't rate it as a negative game, but I would certainly understand why people would think so, and I think that their reasons are valid. Bethesda does scummy things of late, and that affects consumer confidence. That affects my ability to purchase future Bethesda titles. It makes me extremely wary of things that they'll do in the future. But even then, that's a maybe. then I have to make a consumer decision based on things that might happen, based on things that have happened in the past, and based on who we're talking about. And again, that's a gray area. But again, as consumers, we need to change the way that maybe we look at reviews and don't just look at a number or look at a percentage and say, that means that obviously XYZ. When I look at reviews for games, which isn't necessarily often, there's a decent number of people that I trust, that I know and speak with and play with personally, that I get suggestions for. I bought Hellblade because Rambo's Corner said it was really awesome, and so I was looking for a game to play, so I picked it up. I've bought far more games based on the recommendations of people that I know and trust than I ever did based purely on Steam reviews alone. Maybe that's an attitude that more of us need to have. I don't know, I can't say really. Maybe I'll put some more time into the thought. But hopefully we're not just looking at a certain number and a review score and instantly smashing the buy button. Hopefully there's more to it than that. I want us to take a look at how we look at review scores. Nathan Grayson's Kotaku article clearly paints review bombing as a problem, flat out. And others in the article made me scratch my head and start to worry. Andrew Gleason, who worked on Titan Souls, he puts the Steam negative review upvoting, of course. By the way, Nathan, you should capitalize Steam there. That is a proper noun. We capitalize those in English. Gleason lists the negative review upvoting on Steam reviews as an exploit in the system. That's exploiting the system in his mind. If you go to a game after hearing something terrible about it, or you want to display your dissatisfaction with the game, or you didn't like a game, and you go to the reviews and you upvote the negative ones, that is exploiting the system, and it's something that Valve needs to sort out. In that paragraph I showed you, he said Twitter needs to sort out their shit in regards to Twitter notifications flooding with harassment. And anyone who's used Twitter for any amount of time, and I've only been on it for about a year now, but it's exactly this kind of attitude, the demand that social media platforms and the demand that Valve moderate its content, that leads to an overall loss in quality of things that are posted on it. As a Twitter user with about 27,000 followers, it's legitimately difficult for me to see many replies. Even after I change my settings, things are constantly hidden from me. Words mean I have to click in order to see them. There are comments and replies that I am never able to see because they just aren't there. Twitter will show that there's a reply, but I can't see it. It's hiding replies from me on social media. Twitter, I want to see replies. That's why I have Twitter. That's why we see so many times accounts being blocked and banned for not having the right opinions or the right ideas. Look for Sargon of Akkad's Twitter. It's not around anymore for reasons that are ambiguous at best and undeniably inconsistent. And you want Valve to start stepping up their game in terms of moderating this kind of behavior? Look at YouTube. People screamed for ages that YouTube needed to moderate its content, that certain people simply didn't need to be on YouTube. They needed to be deplatformed from the system, that there was no place for them. And now look what we have created. This is what happens when you ask for authoritarian measures to be taken against things that you don't necessarily like. It is a long, deep, and dark rabbit hole to start walking down. And sometimes you can't just turn around and see the sunshine and crawl your way back out. Sometimes things get a little more complicated. I don't have too many problems with Valve overall, but even then, the last thing that I want from Valve is for them to start getting their fingers more and more mixed in with what consumers have to say. I don't trust them, and oftentimes this is a direction that you don't simply get to walk yourself back from. In any event, I think I've spoken at length for long enough. Those are my thoughts and my concerns about Steam review bombing. Like I said, I think it's a discussion that is worth having, and I'm interested to see what the comments have to say below. By the way, if you don't see your comment down below, it's not because I've deleted it. I don't delete comments, so don't worry about anything like that. YouTube's just really screwy with what they do and do not show to people. I'm interested to hear what you think, so please leave a comment below if you feel like you have something to say or add. Is there more to be said? Absolutely, but I have a pretty high level of confidence that this is not the last time I will ever visit this subject. So let me know what you think, and I'll see you later. Thanks for watching. Send nudes. Give me a kiss.